other minds. And so are non-human primates, apes in particular. Everything is out there, social, interactional, interpersonal. In a certain sense, both apes and young children don't even have a sense of mind, that they have minds. There are studies showing until 7 to 8, children don't introspect, are not aware in a robust sense of their own thoughts. Looks counterintuitive, but it's a fairly robust result. So after 4 is an age in which this intuitive psychology turns toward their own minds. They realize that they have mental states that are called beliefs, desires, hopes, and so forth. Turn very quickly to the last autobiographical sense of selfhood. All I can say, I have a few remarks I might develop in the questions and answers, but I will again point out the simple fact that autobiographical memory, and memory understood not just memory understood as a projection device. It can be about the past, but can be about the future, can be about the possible. So I say autobiographical memory, I mean autobiographical projections. Develop only after the age of 4 and take some time to develop. This is also known as it's called infantile, but in fact it's not infantile, it's early childhood amnesia. We don't remember the first 3 to 4 years. Personally, vividly. We may remember from the stories of others. Is taken by many psychologists of memory as indication of a lack of autobiographical memory, the only one that consolidates memories. Okay, so at this point, I'm turning to the second and last part of my talk, which is why this mental architecture, why these tasks, or rather, why have evolved these mental capabilities, executing the tasks, executive cognitive sense of selfhood that I went through. What's the point, what's the reason for self-reflection? Now, before I go to this, there is one point that I want to make about autobiographical memory that plays a major role in my story. Unlike other forms of memory, procedural, semantic, which are about facts, and particularly episodic, vivid experiences, what you smelled, what you saw, what you heard, and so forth, which are typically first-person experiences. And they are retained as first-person experiences. Autobiographical memory may be first-person, but most of the time, and as children develop, and as they age, and adults age, and so forth, there is another and very surprising novelty, which is a third-person or observer perspective. There is the large literature in memory research showing that variety of contexts in which we remember and project from a neutral observer perspective, not from a first-person perspective. In fact, most of our memories, it turns out, are from a third-person perspective, mixed with a few perceptual experiences, but a lot of semantic data, a lot of what other people said, a lot of calendar information and stuff like this. It's a cocktail of elements that produce a observer perspective on memory, and some memory researchers think that that's the reason why autobiographical memories get consolidated. All right. Very quickly, the evolutionary side. Why this mental architecture of self-reflection? Why self-reflection? To give an answer, there are some, and I will go telegraphically, there are some evolutionary puzzles about self-reflection, its architecture. It's phylogenetically unique, unprecedented in other animal species. There is absolutely no evidence of self-reflection in any other organism. But I also gave you some pointers, participating capabilities that would have to be there. It lacks a dedicated genetic basis and specialized brain sites. There are no specialized brain sites for self-reflection. In fact, there are no specialized brain sites for any intellectual activity. Imagination, deliberation, and so forth. You cannot go and say as a neuroscientist, this is where the brain deliberates, or where the brain takes decision or self-reflects. And there are no genes for something like this. Another puzzle is, why would the mind turn inward to self-reflect when for all animal species the evolutionary action is outside, in the behavior and relations of the organism to the world that secure well-being, development, survival, and reproduction? What's the point of turning inward? We are the only species apparently that does this. A third puzzle is why this gap between animal minds, mind 1 and mind 2, deep and wide, when it is well known in classical evolutionary theory that natural selection operates incrementally, frugally, building on acquisitions from other species and their genomes and so forth, whereas this doesn't seem to be the case. There are no rudiments of intellect, of mind too, in other species. This is what led Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of evolution by natural selection, to argue against Darwin that natural selection explains everything except the human mind. But I think what he meant is mind too. Standard explanations don't help either, I think. These are animal and human practices widely believed to have generated selection pressures for these high intellectual abilities. Tool use and tool making, sophisticated social politics among some species, including communication and some transmission of production and transmission of culture. I call them the standard practices. What's wrong with the standard practices? Well, what's wrong is that they are present in various degrees in a good number of species, certainly non-human primates, dolphins, elephants, other species, which had tens of millions of years to evolve something like mind too, and they haven't. Which means to me that the selection pressures in these standard practices are not sufficiently and persistently strong to lead to an intellect, to lead to self-reflection in particular. Human ontogeny itself shows what marvelous achievements young minds can obtain until age 4, just inconceivable in the animal world. Assimilation of language, the basics of language, assimilation of the basics of culture, assimilation of the basics of socialization and communication, all of this normal young children can do, which animals cannot. And yet, they do it without any self-reflection. They do it without any intellect. In fact, there are good arguments that not having an inward look, not having an intellect and self-reflection simplifies the task of, so complicated task of assimilating language and culture and so forth. So if young children can do things that animals cannot do without self-reflection, it means that indeed there is no argument that standard practices of elephants and apes and so forth will lead to mind too and self-reflection. So what's happening after 4? Well, basically what's happening after the age of 4, and that what I'm saying now it's true also of adults, is that older children enter gradually a world of cultural sociopolitics without precedent in their life, quite different from what they had in the more warm, comforting, defensive family, friends surrounding, particularly strangers, which forces their minds for the first time to engage in what I call strategizing, something that they did not have to do before. Let me put it a bit different. The life of most animal species and the life of human children between 0 and 4 is in a fairly well-regulated, regimented, stable environment. These are not environments that require great mental effort of figuring out new things, strategizing, and so forth. The life after 4, and the rest of the human life, is among strangers, and it forces people to do new mental moves to deal with strangers. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I will summarize as, it's a very competitive world, first of all. This is what I mean by political. Social means interaction. And culture means, in an anthropological sense, the habits, norms, values of practices of the community in which you operate. And all of these factors have to be figured out by the minds of children and later adults in interacting with each other, and particularly with strangers. And as somebody put it, as a result, older children become, in this sense, seasoned politicians, social politicians. There is another challenge, unlike the first 4 years of life, and unlike other animal species. Interpersonal relations after the age of 4 are increasingly vicarious, invisible, and mediated symbolically by language and inferential interpretation of what others say, think, and do. Nothing is visible. Nothing is obvious. You have to interpret something which you don't have to do in the first 4 years, and something which most animal species don't have to do. So you have to start thinking offline how to respond, how to interpret, how to figure out the actual meaning. And this is a context in which the adaptation that responds to this is what I call strategizing. I'm going to give you a formal definition, which I'm going to read because it's a bit complicated, but is the pursuit of one's goals by metamentally rehearsing offline how to represent and handle the thoughts, attitudes, utterances, reactions, and actions of others, and in response of one's own, including iterations of such incremental interactions between self and others. Differently phrased, strategizing is mentally rehearsing how to reach one's goals by representing and manipulating the mental states and actions of others, and how to enable and influence others to reach or not their goals by means of representing the mental states and actions of oneself for cooperative or competitive reasons. Basically, it means amalgamating in advance, offline, rehearsing, interactions of mental states, representations of mental states, attitudes, and so forth of others and one's own, relative to one's goals and relative to the cultural norms, values, habits, practices prevailing. All of this have to be computed when you interact with others. The fact that we do it so naturally without thinking shows that it's a deep-seated competence. The fact that we are very good at it shows that it's a deep-seated competence, almost exactly like the knowledge of Romanian or English. So let's not be fooled by the more complicated but adaptive a competence is, the more chances that evolution has geneticized it. Exactly like with the knowledge of phonetics and grammar and things like that. So any normal person becomes at a certain moment through development very good at. We are very good at strategizing. Just always remember gossip. Okay, and let me give you just very briefly, because I'm running out of time. Here are some examples of strategizing you'll immediately recognize. Rehearsing what to say and what to do when in conflict with someone else. Repairing a conflictual situation by comparing and adjusting in one's mind the emotions and attitudes involved on both sides. Planning how to relate to some difficult colleague and how to react to his reactions. Deliberate and planned lies or obfuscation. Diplomatic lies, we do this probably several times a day. This is strategizing. Gossip directed at the mental states and resulting actions of others, including self-involved gossip. Self-advertising. Supporting one's opinion with reason and arguments in order to persuade someone or defend oneself. Interpersonal diplomacy, and so on and so on and so forth. These are examples of strategizing. I can have an immense list of, we do it, let me put it this way, is a main activity of the human mind, beginning with age 4. There is nothing else that takes more mental time and energy in our lives than strategizing. In a huge variety of contexts, forms, and so forth. Okay, I'm almost done. I missed a number of things, but the last thing that I want to say a few words, and I may elaborate, is this, you would say, the strategizing could explain the reflectiveness of self-reflection. What about the sense of me, self, which is a self of self-reflection? Where does it show up and why? And the basic insight here is that this is what older children acquire, recognize, and become aware because of the reactions of others, personal as well as collective, normally reflecting the cultural rules, norms, values, and customs of the surrounding community, as well as more specific inter-individual habits and histories. The concept for this is conscience. And let me give you two examples. One, an American sage, H.L. Mencken, which says, conscience is the inner voice that tells you that somebody may be looking. And there is an equally famous example of Jean-Paul Sartre, which I will personalize for expositive reasons. This is Sartre. Suppose I look furtively through a keyhole, and imagining being seen doing this by an observer, become conscious of myself, of me, self in my terminology, doing something improper, and feel ashamed as a result. Notice that in both Mencken and Sartre's examples, the impersonal and detached observer is imagined by me as doing something improper. This is a voice of conscience, is an observer internalized. And another student of, so the general idea here is that socio-culturally regulated and conscience constrained strategizing is the incubator, the scaffolder of this sense of me, self, this sense of the projected, virtual, displaced. This is how it started in evolution. Then it can take a life of its own. It's not a new idea. Freud was talking about superego. William James was talking about me as being this extra self. They didn't talk about the sense of self, which is my interest, but, and I think a very distinguished early American philosopher, I think much neglected in the rest of the world, George Herbert Mead, who studied much this, has a very interesting point, I quote, "It is just because the individual finds himself taking the attitudes of the others who are involved in his conduct that he becomes an object for himself. It is only by taking the roles of others that we have been able to come back to ourselves. So is this idea that the me-self is a target of the attitudes of others, but not only personalized, also the attitudes of the surrounding culture. This is how things are done in my community, and I'm not doing it. In which case, the emotion of shame shows up, or I am doing it, and the emotion of pride shows up. This combination of emotions and of the attitudes of the surrounding culture and other people toward me have the role of constructing a sense of me, a sense of me-self, the third, which is the one, obviously it's a virtual and displaced one, is not arrow at my physical being or anything like this. Is some people call, but it's a bit tricky, self-image. But the point that I'm making in a sort of ontogenetic evolutionary terms is that after the age of 4, entering a world of strangers, of cultural norms, habits, practices, and so forth, becoming increasingly aware of it, the child, and then us adults, acquire a sense of these external attitudes and external pressures that are sort of captured by the notion of conscience, which initially had an evolutionary, exactly like the examples of Mencken and Sartre indicate, namely an inner voice that tells you you should do this, you shouldn't do that, which is obviously a selection pressure. I didn't talk about the biological vocabulary, but this is basically it, that this cultural social politics, not the standard practices of tool making, and which you can immediately realize are much stronger than making or using tools, are much more persistent throughout life, are much more difficult to manage. I mentioned that they are invisible usually, transmitted through language, which is not always clear. You have to interpret, therefore, as a complicated machinery. So in my account, these selection pressures win over the traditional evolutionary analysis of the tool maker, tool user, cultural transmission, Machiavellian politics in which you deceive, which apes do a lot. These are much stronger, and one of their byproducts is this construction of the sense of self. 2 remarks and I'm done. One is you cannot strategize in evolutionary terms, that is when the competence is set up and is most often applied, without being autobiographical. You always want to influence others or respond to the influence of others by connecting with your personal history, with what you like, with what you've done, and so forth. So strategizing has to start on an autobiographical note, even though later, like any competence, it can have applications beyond autobiographical context. And second, I think the story of conscience, moral, with its emotions of shame, pride, and so forth, reinforces, very interestingly, from a completely different direction, which I haven't sufficiently explored and researched, this emergence after 4 of autobiographical memory from an impersonal observer position. Because this is what conscience is an internalized observer, impersonal. And here is autobiographical projections that abandon the first-person perspective, which is short-lived, which is mere experience, and retreat to a complicated observer position toward past life, future life, possible life. What is a connection? I can see certain relations, but it's an interesting evolutionary coincidence, the emergence of this construction of the me-self, the emergence of conscience as a regulator of individual behavior, and the emergence of the observer position of third-person perspective in autobiographical memory, in autobiographical projections in general. And remember, as I said earlier, when I talk about autobiographical memory, I talk about mind is memory. Voila. Thank you very much. The inevitable question, are there questions? Take your time. There's a question here. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. So I was wondering, what is the relation, if there is one, between the sense of self and the metacognitive feelings? For instance, the feeling
the metaphor of?
And the metacognitive feelings, like the feeling of certainty. When I'm monitoring my own mental capabilities, I am certain that I know the capital of Peru or whatever. And yeah, and this metacognitive feeling could be placed in what you call mind one or system one. So you could have a minimal sense of self even at this basic level.
That's right. First, as you say, I mean, metacognition seems to be a very animal-wide capabilities, usually monitoring, regulating, improving perception, action, memory, action, circuits, and habits. I think this is why it has evolved. And improving one's learning, that is feedback to mislearning or from things like that. Let me see how to put it. We shouldn't forget that, so it's a basic capability of the animal mind, but in the human mind, inevitably, and I don't know exactly when, ontogenetically, after a while, it starts interacting with mental acquisitions, which we don't have in animal minds. This thing, I put it like this, but in fact, it's fairly permeable at a certain point, right? So, metacognition, let's say after a certain age, in human children and adults, is beginning to interact with intellectual competencies, is beginning to interact with forms of memory which are distinctly human, like, for example, working memory, but that's a space, but autobiographical memory. I have no idea with what it interacts, but fact is that it does. So I'm always cautious when you make a certain move. There is a certain property that animals have and young children have, metacognition. It allows you to do B, right, feeling of something, but you ignore C, namely that it allows you or somebody in our situation who is already equipped with a number of many other competencies that are likely to interact with this metacognition. So as a result, it's no longer the ancestral metacognition of simpler species, simpler modalities. That's the best I can say about it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I really like the example of white lies. So, suppose I meet a colleague I'm writing a paper with, and they ask me, suppose they're a bit senior, and they ask me, what were you just going at? I was just thinking about the paper we're about to write, right? Obviously a white lie, right? Oftentimes, not always. So, is your view going to diagnose that as a case where I will have somehow strategized things and self-reflected in the light of our past interactions and anticipating our future interactions, so that the white lie comes out so naturally and so on, so that there's going to be it seems as though there's going to be a lot of computation that never ever emerges at the level of phenomenal consciousness, and so it seems as though there's a lot of work behind the scenes that's somehow sort of posited by this, autobiographical self-reflection.
Yeah, quite good question. I mean, I said it's what I've done a sort of analytic dissection of what it takes to self-reflect and went through the various tasks and so on and so forth. And I remember I said in the beginning that I would make this distinction, the Chomskyan-like distinction, but applied here, the surface grammar of Romanian versus the deep universal grammar. This is a deep mental architecture and the deep computational machinery of self-reflection, of strategizing in general, of which I didn't have time to develop this, of which self-reflection is a main regulative component. We self-reflect initially in order to self-regulate our responses to the world and so forth. But clearly the computational mechanics is very complex. And indeed, I think there is a rule admitted in cognitive science: the more often it is used and the more complex it is going to go down much below the level of consciousness. If it were close to the level of consciousness, it would be much less efficacious. We will stumble. You don't have to think, you have to do it. So many of the examples, including white lies, diplomatic lies, and so do it like this. We don't have to, which to me is a sign of a deep, well-oiled competence. Of course, it improves with age. I'm sure that young children 4 and later go. But it's exactly like with language. I mean, it's very interesting that there is even in the early period, 0 to 4, there is an effort to manage the names and manage and once the competence gets going, it becomes so easy and natural. So both strategizing and self-reflection become what can be called mental reflexes. It's rare that when there are too many players and too delicate situations that you have to stop and sort of start thinking and playing and rehearsing, which you can do, everybody can do. But white lies, diplomatic lies, and so forth, my guess is that we produce white lies about at least 50 times a day. Therefore, it must be just, no job at all. And take no time. And also, one has to assume, like in language, there must be shortcuts. Experience teaches you a number of things. So you don't have to go through all the computational steps and so forth. So basically, this is how I would respond both for strategizing and its self-reflecting core. A deep competence, already very well settled, and whose computational dynamics must be formidable in terms of employment and exercise. I would put it close to, not quite in, but close to the computational complexity of grammar. I don't see, except grammar, anything in our daily mental life that will even approach the mental complexity and frequency of use of what I call strategizing. Yeah.
Just a really quick follow-up,
Please.
if I may. So you started out by talking about this difference between mind one and mind two, right? And the naturalness of these examples and the fact that we do them so carefree, right, seems to suggest that maybe this is a denizen of both mind one and mind two. I mean, it's clearly, it doesn't have the hallmarks of overt explicitness, this kind of deliberative character, right? It could in special circumstances.
Which one?
The kind of sort of everyday small lies we say and so on, and the kind of self-reflection that this might involve.
Right.
It doesn't seem to be that kind of deliberative, explicit sort of talking to ourselves about what's...
That's very good. In fact, there is what's called, in this literature on the two minds, in fact, there is even a collection called Two Minds. There is one school of thought, and a particular individual, I think a Canadian psychologist, whose last name I think is Stanovich, who, in the mind too, what I call the intellect, has distinguished two. I wanted to simplify. As you see, I haven't been able to cover half of my material, so couldn't add this, but has distinguished two systems in mind too. That is the intellect. I forgot which is which. Probably system one, which I think he calls algorithmic, is the one which may have started, again ontogenetically, may have started slowly, serially, deliberately, and so forth, and then reflexivized itself, became a reflex. Okay, shortcuts, things like that, and so forth, until it became a bunch of algorithms, algorithm type responses, which automatically respond to various domains and so on and so forth. You don't have to do anything. And I think he is on the right track. If you look at the literature of Kahneman, thinking fast, thinking slow, Gigerenzer, this German ethologist, cognitive scientist, and so forth, who have argued that in many situations it's better to let your intuitions decide, not your deliberate reasoning. What they meant, I think, by intuitions is this, what this Stanovich is talking about. This is system one of mind two, that is intellectual shortcuts, or sort of intellectual shortcuts, which consistent, frequent experience has made them algorithmical, tested by life, and tell you without much reasoning what to do, how to decide, and so forth. Leaving system two on the top of mind two, those intellectual activities which you cannot algorithmicized like this, like theorizing, complex moral decisions, complex political decisions, and so forth, where there are no algorithms, there are no intuitions, and they may even be detrimental. So there seems to be a division of labor. And what is interesting about this, again, the point I made earlier, is that whenever nature, meaning natural selection, can optimize something by making it automatic and reflex like grammar, like parts of it will do it. It will do it going often as far down as a genome, but certainly as far up as mental reflexes, memory patterns, and so forth. Living for purely intellectual pursuits and learning, because all of this more or less are almost like innate. Well, many are not innate, but behave like innate, these intuitions. And living for learning and for ratiocination and for deep thinking are situations and cases where it will be detrimental, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to produce algorithms and produce intuitions.
You talked about a sense of self. What about the self? What's your opinion?
I knew that this is coming. Well, sense is because everything had to do with how it is registered in the mind. Okay, but I have a bit of a story about the self. In all cases, it's a matter of determining the self, right? How do you establish selfhood, even outside the sense of self? And one is a tradition going back to John Locke, which basically said you have two criteria to establish selfhood. Is bodily continuity. Don't count on that too much as we age. And there is psychological continuity, particularly memory. And in general, or there are examples like, which were much discussed in the analytic philosophy literature. You take which is similar to your question in a certain sense. You take a boat and you take a piece of the boat and replace it with something else looking identical. And then you keep going, doing like this. And toward the end of this process, you ask yourself, is this the same boat you started with or not? This is a sort of objective, impersonal way at looking at continuity criteria of selfhood in general. There is a subjective line which was made famous by, well, Descartes, but particularly David Hume, who said famously, I look inside myself, I introspect myself, and find no self. The only thing that I find subjectively are thoughts, ideas, perception, memories. Where is the self? There is no self, says Hume. Okay? It's an invention, it's subjective. Okay? The line that I took in this, given the topic, is subjective and egocentric. That is how the mind inside has a sense of self, but is not the subjective experience of Hume looking inside, and it rather is a mechanisms design theoretical analysis? What sort of mechanisms give us a sense of self? Okay, so these are the main approaches, and beyond them, I don't think there is much constructive things to say about self. I don't see much conceptual, philosophical, cognitive, scientific room to either you go objective and impersonal and ask what criteria do I have to recognize that a certain person is the same person as. That's the logic of selfhood, objectively. Or you go subjectively inside and talk about experiencing, registering, having a sense of. With bifurcations, you can do it like Hume. In experience, you can do it the way I proposed, and other people have proposed, to look at the mechanism and etc. Common sense and ordinary language have a way of playing other games which we misinterpret. For example, when you say